address an issue that I think, it's one I encounter quite often with my colleagues at university and all, and it's something that I wanted to deal with, and that's the issue of size and complexity, or scale, and these sort of things. That looking at size and structure within societies, and what I really want to do is address this issue that people sometimes talk about in terms of, there's a tendency to, and I think that all of my colleagues today have refuted this almost beyond comprehension, but there's a tendency to describe a lot of these things that we've been hearing about as primitive, and I really think this is a useless concept, and it's become standard terminology, but I don't believe it means anything, because I think of what a lot of these, what are called primitive peoples, are not primitive in any sense of the word. They simply live in smaller and simpler groups, and this changes the dynamic. And I think on a lot of, like the stuff Lois was talking about in terms of community and working things out through a community, all these sorts of things emerge. And the lack of complexity, that is the lack of the sheer numbers involved in these situations, means that these people deal with reality and life in a very hands-on manner. It's not an abstract concept. And the stuff Linda was just talking about is a classic example of that. You know, that a Heyoka comes and essentially, you know, throws you back into life even when you're trying to avoid it. So in dealing with the natural world, smaller societies make this interaction personal. And again, I think every one of the talks we've heard today has illustrated this point. So that when people are discussing their world in terms of relationships, they're not relying upon models or theoretical constructs. Now, one of my great conundrums as a biologist and a behavioral and evolutionary ecologist working with indigenous people has been that when I find myself looking at indigenous knowledge, I'm trying to construct theory, at least that's what I found myself trying to do, for scientific traditions that don't have a need for constructing theory, because essentially it's all lived and real, and it doesn't need to be abstract because it's very, very personal. And the reason is that the theory interferes with relationships, and this is a thing that I've really struggled with in terms of Western science. They try to universalize meaning for a dynamic interaction that has meaning on its own terms. And so the only exception that I have to this are the possible theoretical concepts that I tend to work with, that are those that emerge from relationships, such as the idea that all things are connected, or the things that all things are related. And these are, in many ways, these are spiritual principles rather than scientific theory, although one of the points I make regularly in some of my presentations and all is that all things are connected is the basic premise of ecology, and all things are related is the basic premise of evolutionary biology. So what you're looking at in terms of a lot of these cultures, these simpler cultures, is a lack of theory, and excessive complexity means that the knowledge that emerges is from long-term experience based on the specific function of that knowledge. The stuff that Nima was talking about earlier in terms of the hunting stories is a good example of this, that people are putting things that they see to very practical use. And this sort of goes against the tendency that a lot of us have as academics, where we try to generalize and make larger points. And in many cases, what we're looking at is information and knowledge that's been accumulated over very long periods of time, and that patterns emerge, but these are relevant to individuals and to the survival of the culture and the people involved, rather than to a body of theory. So, I think that some Western approaches tend to stumble simply because they're seeking universal solutions in situations where specifically locally based relationships have appeared. And these have evolved, but at the same time, the way they're understood, and one of the things when I work with my indigenous students and try to talk to them about evolution, is that there's a recognition over these long periods of time that these sorts of things have evolved, but in many cases, they don't necessarily feel the necessity to embed it within evolutionary theory. Now, one of the classic examples of this to me, of this approach, is from Gene Anderson's book, Ecologies of the Heart, which is still one of my all-time favorite books, because Gene emphasizes this theme about specific locally based relationships, because these relationships build mutual dependence. And I think in contrast, when our societies get larger, of necessity they become more complex in terms of interhuman dynamics. This reduces the connections and the relationships, especially between humans and non-humans. So Western science functions very well at large and small scales. It's wonderful in terms of chemistry and physics, and also of cosmology, or the study of planetary bodies and their movement. Where it functions less effectively, and I think in many cases even less well than indigenous or these sort of older, more traditional ways of knowing about the world, is at the ecological level. And at the large and small scales, personal relationships are reduced to large-scale overarching concepts. These cannot become personal. That is, gravity exists. It's not personal. And so, that sort of thing is a very wonderful way of looking at it. It's not that Western science is weak, it just has certain limitations that often are not acknowledged, and especially when Western science tries to operate at all scales, sometimes it is less successful. Because one of the things that we sometimes, I think, fail to keep in mind is that humans are organisms. They need a personal, they need relationships and connections. One of the things that I think is an issue in our society today is a lot of people have become disconnected in many ways from the natural world, and even from their fellow humans in some ways, so that they become lost, frustrated, and disconnected. One of the ways this manifests itself in contemporary American society is a lot of people, a lot of Americans today, we all probably know some people like this, think autonomy means a lack of connection and responsibility to others. Not that autonomy emerges from connection and responsibility. Tyaki Alford, the Mohawk philosopher and writer, has addressed this very point, that autonomy has to emerge from connection and from responsibility. It cannot exist on, I'm an independent being and I'm the lone wolf and I'm all these things. Because one of the great ironies that I've learned over the years is a lone wolf is a miserable animal. Societies become so large that it's become difficult to relate to others and their suffering. So as a consequence, you can see people on the televised news and commentators saying, these poor people, it's their fault. If they would only work harder, they would become successful. And what they're doing is essentially throwing away a tradition, because if you look at how you build connection in these so-called primitive societies, pretty much everybody knows everyone else, and as a consequence, it was necessary to ensure that the weakest had their needs cared for and that the strongest had the greatest obligations. You think about this in terms of what we're hearing and what we see today in American society, we're essentially trying to see almost the opposite, and I find this very troubling. And the issue is that this works very well at small scales where the personal is important. But at large scales, because these connections have been lost, this tends to vanish. And I think in particular with some issues that we're dealing with, especially in this society, if you look at ecology and effective conservation, one of the problems we're facing today in the world is this tendency to think that Western societies and Western knowledge and Western science have the answers, and that one of the answers is, especially in terms of defining conservation and wilderness, to make sure that people are not part of the system rather than being continually part of the system. And this is a problem because those people who inhabit an environment are the ones that know a place and care about it. Gene, in his book, has emphasized this extremely well. And as a consequence, a lot of these abstract global solutions that are designed to conserve or create wilderness areas or things like that are going to fail or only succeed at superficial levels, which only exacerbates the problem. Because to a lot of these people, caring is theoretical. I love nature. I'm concerned about the rainforest. Not that I have a personal relationship with these places and things. And as a consequence, it becomes abstract rather than personal. Now, in contrast, when you're looking at social rank and status within a lot of indigenous cultures, in these small, simple societies, and I'm using the term men here because this is what I know best. It's not that I'm excluding women from this, but men attain status through cooperation and altruistic behavior. This is the principle of the potlatch. And the potlatch scared the hell out of Western people when they first heard about it. This is why they banned it and made it actually, they would put people in jail for holding a potlatch, because the potlatch was the idea, oh, I'm wealthy and powerful, therefore I can give everything I have away, which also sort of links back to the Heyoka tradition that Linda was talking about. You know, the idea that you do the opposite of what might normally be expected. And that the knowledge that these people acquire is used to allow things to function rather than to attain wealth, that is large amounts of material goods and power. That men in these societies have power which is achieved through ensuring the survival of as much as possible, and this is not only the members of their society, but also of all the species and the physical places themselves that surround them. And so one of the things that I think we've done today is we've created what I'm calling here the destruction of the simple. And I've chosen this image here about the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. To me, one of the things, the saddest things I found, and I've learned this repeatedly from talking to people in different cultures over a number of years, is that many times what we call poachers, especially in places like Africa, are the indigenous people who really resent being pushed out of their lands and being removed. And so as a result, they you know, it's almost sort of like Calvin Martin's old argument about keepers of the game. That they turn not only from no longer being the protectors, but also in some cases to almost being the opponents of the conservation efforts. And so the global economy and Western traditions will destroy indigenous knowledge. They draw simpler entities into their milieu, and so the relationships and shared mutual responsibility become lost. And in consequence, to me at least, a lot of these Western solutions are failing. They really need these older values, these older ways of thinking about the world to survive. And I think all of my colleagues today here have shown you actual physical examples from their own experiences, from their own peoples, of what this sort of thing means. So I'd like to sort of close with this image here. Are these people our future? Or are they simply locked in our past and we choose to ignore them and treat them as if they were artifacts? And I think this is when Linda talked earlier about being annoyed or PO'd at the way in which society, cultural traditions become sort of caricatured and turned into cartoons and cliches. One of the things we tend to do is look at one of the sadder things I saw when I walked downtown a couple of days ago and saw young men dressed in plains powwow regalia posing for tourists for money. And I'm thinking, I understand why they do it. I understand they have to make a living, but there is power in who they are. They don't need to imitate or take up some other image from people to essentially gain the power and influence they should have. And one of the things that I often tell my students in my classes is that one thing I learned, especially working with some of the First Nations peoples in Canada, is that, and this may be a humbling bit of information, I know it was to me, they view European white civilization as a phenomena they have to survive, to persist beyond. They expect that it's going to collapse and go away, and their goal in this sort of thing is to continue to try to protect their fellow beings, because as one of them explained to me one time, we just assume when you guys go away that you not have wiped out any of our relatives while during the brief time you were here. And here's a classic example of this in today's world. If you look at the history of many of the tribes, especially on the plains, in the days of the buffalo, wolfing was a subcategory in which a lot of the buffalo hunters would poison or shoot the wolves as well. And the Indian people were bitterly opposed to this. In fact, one of the things they fought battles over and would kill buffalo hunters over was if they found them killing wolves. Well, today this manifests itself in a real interesting way, and it makes me very cynical about things like the Obama administration and its removal of protection from wolves at the federal level. If you look at it, it's really interesting. I've just been sort of trying to get into and learn more about what's going on in these situations. Recent efforts by the federal government and a number of states to remove protection from wolves have stimulated a number of tribes, particularly some of the Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin and all, to essentially say, we're not going to take them. For one thing, they will not allow any hunting of wolves on any sort of lands that they have any influence or control over. And the other more impressive thing at some levels is they've told the state of Wisconsin in particular, we're going to take all the walleye this year. There's not going to be any sport fishing because we have a tribal right to take all the walleye. You people won't listen to us. We're going to use what power we have to try to get you to stop this silly persecution of our brothers. And what this illustrates to me is that despite 500 years of colonization, a lot of these tribes are still trying to protect wolves, and I think in the stories Nemo was talking about illustrate this sort of thing. And I want to make sure that one of the goals to me, and one of the reasons I find this society so powerful and is that I think this society is one of the groups that actually can work with people to try to preserve these older other ways of thinking, and also to sort of emphasize the importance of species that are often marginalized or even demonized by the dominant culture. Thank you. Okay, so one of the things I've especially